Show me. Sylvan. Okay. Wow. Welcome, everyone, to this special evening. This is quite amazing. It's truly an honor. My name is Karen Miller Jackson, for those of you who don't know me. It is truly an honor to have organized and to be facilitating this evening in memory of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs Zatzal. Better? Can you hear me? Okay. It is a blessing for me to be able to merge two sources of inspiration in my life. Matana Sharon, which has been my Beit Midrash and my second home for many years. And more recently, my involvement in studying the thought and getting to know the personality of Rabbi Sachs. I've had the privilege over the past few months of delving deep into Rabbi Sachs's philosophy and thoughts, and also hearing more about the leader and role model that he was through being a member of the second cohort of the Sachs Scholars Program. This is a program which we have some of the leadership here, and thank you for coming, and some of the scholars themselves. The scholars are about a group of 20 leaders from around the world, and I have to say that spending time with them over the summer was, for me, they provided me with tremendous positivity, wisdom, and their kindness just brought me a lot of hope for Am Yisrael. Tonight, we'll be drawing on the thought of Rabbi Sachs, in particular as it relates to language and to hope, to tikkun chevrati, to healing and repairing Israeli society and healing the Jewish people. I want to thank the Rabbi Sachs legacy, and especially want to thank Matan HaSharon for making this event possible. We are We are here to mark the fourth yahrzeit of Rabbi Sachs, and judging from the number of people in this room, it is clear that his thought is still more relevant than ever. I also want to take a moment to thank the Listenberg family, who are particularly committed to spreading Torat Harav Sachs in Israel. And this evening is dedicated Le'ilui Nishmat Aharon ben Chaim Pinchas and Sila bat Moshe Listenberg. May their memory be for a blessing. As with all the learning we do at Matan, we also dedicate this evening to the memory of those we have lost, and with prayers for a refuah shlema, physically and emotionally, for all who need it, and for the return of the hostages, and for the safety and success of our chayalim. I also want to encourage you all to join our classes at Matan. On your way out, you'll be able to take flyers and see the amazing classes and programs in Hebrew and in English. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Dr. Tanya White, who worked with me on this evening and who teaches the thought of Rabbi Sachs, has been teaching it for many years here and is now teaching it in Hebrew as well. And those of you who see many of my students here know that in my class on Sefer Shmot and Megillat Esther, I bring quite a bit of Rabbi Sachs's thought and commentary. So in addition to all of that, please join us for classes here. Yes, yes, yes. Before we begin the official program, I want to take a moment to express Hakarat Hatov to one woman in particular, my teacher and friend, Rabbanit Oshra Koren. Woo! Just wait. Oshra, as so many know here, you are a leader in the truest sense. Rabbi Sachs said that he learned about what it is to be a leader from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And to quote him, he said, "What I learned from him, from the Rebbe, was that a good leader creates followers. A great leader creates leaders." Oshra, by this standard, you are truly a great leader. You have provided space here for women like Tanya and myself and many others to learn, to grow, to develop our voices, to initiate inspiring evenings like tonight. You've created a center, a community for women and men, see, I was going to say that, who seek deep Torah learning, which engages with the world around us. Now I want to share a little surprise with all of you. This wasn't planned when we planned the event originally, but it turns out that today is a special day, and you deserve our thanks and appreciation every day, but especially tonight, because tonight you are celebrating a milestone birthday. We we won't say which number because it doesn't matter, because in any case you have the energy of a 20-year-old. On behalf of the Matan staff and the community, we wish you Mazal Tov Ad Mea V'Esrim. I'll do that after. Okay. Now back to Rabbi Sachs, although you see it's all connected. One of the recurring themes, which runs throughout Rabbi Sachs's commentary on the Torah and in the final book that he published, Morality, was the power of speech and the importance of using language responsibly. And to refocus on the common good, using positive and responsible language to refocus on the common good in society over what divides us. Rabbi Sachs wrote on Parshat Metzorah, God created the natural universe with words. We create and sometimes destroy the social universe with words. Rabbi Sachs addressed the increased polarization and hatred in the world. He warned us early on about the dangers of negative language, the phenomena of post-truth, both online and in the real world. He mourned the lost art of being able to argue and reminded us of the importance of machloket l'shem shamayim, the ability to have arguments for the sake of heaven. Rabbi Sachs was particularly prescient when it came to seeing how these issues interacted with the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in our world. And about the spread of post-truth, Rabbi Sachs wrote the following about the BDS movement on college campuses, which, remember, this was written already a number of years ago and has only become more serious. He relates it to the claims of Datan and Aviram in Parshat Korach. He writes as follows: the flagrant falsehoods of the BDS activists that they sometimes utter, such as that Israel was not the birthplace of the Jewish people, that there never was a temple in Jerusalem, that Israel is a colonial power, quote unquote, a foreign transplant alien to the Middle East, rival the claims of Datan and Aviram that Egypt was a land flowing with milk and honey, and that Moshe brought the people out solely in order to kill them in the desert. Why bother with truth when all that matters is power? Thus, the spirit of Korach lives on. Returning to this topic of machloket, here too in Israel, lahavdil, from BDS on campus, we have seen painful divisions within Israeli society as well, particularly before October 7th. And while we've also seen unfathomable faith, unity, and devotion by our heroic chayalim in particular, there's still work to be done here. Is there a common language, a common covenant among Israelis today? Between religious and secular, between those currently serving in the IDF and large numbers of Haredim who have exemptions, between Jewish and non-Jewish citizens, and what about Jews around the world? They are surrounded by post-truth and vicious anti-Zionism. How has their relationship and language about Israel changed this year? And how can we create a language of common commitment and stronger, more positive bonds between the citizens of Israel and between Israel and diaspora Jews? This war is not over, but perhaps it is time to be thinking about these issues now proactively. We talk about the war and we talk about the day after plan for the war, but what about the day after plan for us, for Israel and the Jewish people? When I'm looking for words of repair for Am Yisrael, I turn to the writings of Rabbi Sachs. He called Israel the home of hope, and he says that Jews are the agents of hope in the world. How can we ensure that Israel remains a source of hope for the future? I now invite our wonderful guests to the podium for a conversation on this topic. Okay, just quick intro to who we have up here, our esteemed guests on the podium. Daniel Taub is an Israeli diplomat and international lawyer. He served as the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom and as director of strategy and planning of the Yad HaNadiv Rothschild Foundation. He is the chair of the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Foundation in Israel. He has represented Israel at the UN and in many negotiations. He holds degrees from University College Oxford, University College London, and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. His new book, Beyond Dispute, Rediscovering the Jewish Art of Constructive Disagreement in Divisive Times, will be, you like that, Ricky, will be published soon, and he'll be coming back to talk about all of that. His 5 sons and his son-in-law are all currently serving compulsory or reserve duty in the IDF. Dr. Yoav Heller is the chairman of Harivon Harevi'i, the fourth quarter, as well as the chairman of the Wingate Institute. He is a Holocaust historian, lecturer, and social entrepreneur. He also served as CEO of the Maoz Network, heading a unit in the senior management of Bronco Weiss Institute, and was among the founders of the Ynet website, and held additional key positions in leading organizations. Throughout the years, he has initiated and led major leadership development and Israeli advocacy initiatives, both in Israel and abroad. Yoav serves as an officer in reserves in the Strategic Planning Division, and he is married to Polly, father to Reut and Dani, and lives in Tel Aviv. Okay, Dr. Tanya White. Great having Ricky in the audience. Is a lecturer of Tanakh and Jewish philosophy at Bar Ilan University and serves as a senior lecturer at the Matan Women's Institute of Torah Learning and the London School of Jewish Studies. She was appointed a Sacks Scholar in the inaugural cohort of the Rabbi Sacks Scholars Program. Tanya is also the founder and host of the soon-to-be-released upcoming podcast series, Books and Beyond, the Rabbi Sacks audio series with Tanya White. Tanya lives with her husband and 4 daughters in a moshav in central Israel. Mm-hmm. And her oldest daughter's in the IDF. Yes, it's true. Okay, so now we'll begin. I've asked our 3 panelists our 3 guests, to choose a short piece of Rabbi Sacks's thought, which relates to tonight's topic, words of repair for Israel and the Jewish people. And so we'll begin with this. I'm going to sort of be randomly asking people questions. And what I really hope is that we'll come to a conversation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be disagreement, but of course, if there is disagreement, it will be l'shem shamayim and constructive. And so we're going to get this conversation going. We'll start with you, Daniel. Please share your excerpt and why you chose that. What about it spoke to you for this moment?
Testing. Great. First of all, what a total pleasure to be here this evening. An extraordinary sense of positivity. It feels like an antidote to an awful lot that's going on at the moment. So thank you very, very much for that. I also just want to acknowledge, in addition to all of the wonderful people that you mentioned, that we have a number of people here from the Rabbi Sacks Legacy Foundation in Israel. We have Johnny Lipser, we have Tali Tarlo, and we have very, very close contact at Corin Publishers, Aryeh Grossman, who's done such an extraordinary job in translating Rabbi Sacks's work into Hebrew so beautifully. So it's just wonderful to have them with us. I think so many people at the moment are asking themselves, what would Rabbi Sacks have been saying if he was with us at this terrible, critical moment in Jewish history? And I have to say, along with everything that he wrote, there's something else that's happening, which is that there are these groups of Sacks scholars, including the wonderful Dr. Karen, but so many. And when I go round and I hear them speaking, I get a sense that there is a little bit of a mosaic of what Rabbi Sacks might be saying at this time. And it's a really wonderful thing. But thinking about his books, one of the things that occurred to me was we're at a time for building and rebuilding. And Karen mentioned Rabbi Sacks's last book, which is That's great. Thank you. And it's an extraordinary book. It's a book that is written for the wider world. The basic message of the book, for those of you who still have the pleasure of reading it ahead of you, is really that Western societies have come to rely primarily on two pillars, on the pillar of the state and the pillar of the market. One is power and one is wealth. And by relying on those, they have forgotten a really critical pillar, that central pillar of the common good, of social capital. And that's the argument he makes in morality, and he doesn't mention Israel in that book at all. But the first time he made this argument was probably 15 years earlier, and then it was specifically in relation to Israel. And I wanted to read what he said then because I think it's so relevant to this time. He makes the point that the founders of Israel were fleeing from the dangers of the nation state. So they thought that they needed to have a nation state of their own. And maybe, he suggests, he was very careful about being critical of Israel, but here he actually said maybe they went too far, putting the state above social capital and the common good. And what he said was, the result was that though Israel managed remarkably the transition from powerlessness to power, it did so at the cost of weakening the very institutions that had been the source of Jewish strength in the past: communities, charities, voluntary associations. So while the state grew strong, society grew weak. And then he charted a possible future for Israel, which I think echoes very strikingly today. He said, Zionism phase one gave back to Jewry what it lacked in dispersion: sovereignty and a state. Zionism phase two must reappropriate what Jewry had even when it lacked a state: a profound sense of responsibility to the weak, the poor, the socially marginalized, the neglected and the unheard. That is the challenge for a new religious Zionism, to build a society worthy of being a home for the divine presence by honoring the divine image in all its citizens. And I actually feel very privileged to be reading this while I'm sitting next to Dr. Yoav Heller, who to my mind is an example. I don't think you've probably been called a religious Zionist very often, but according to Rabbi Sachs's definition, that is precisely what you are, which is bringing that sense of social capital and common good into the state of Israel.
So actually, I'm going to give it back to Daniel for one more moment and combine the next question along with that. Given that thinking on Israel, you were close with Rabbi Sachs, and you had the privilege of having a number of conversations with him about the Israel-diaspora relationship and about the state of Israel. Can you share with us, particularly because this evening marks his, even though his fourth yahrzeit is this week, there are many programs going on throughout the country and throughout the world to commemorate this yahrzeit. What can you tell us a little bit about your personal conversations with him and your relationship with him and how that influenced you?
So I have to say it was an extraordinary privilege. We spent a lot of time together, a lot of it in a slightly strange way, because the way that sort of ambassadorial chief rabbi jobs work, we had fancy dinners with each other and a few thousand other people most evenings. On mitzvah day, we would be painting houses together. The community fun run, we would be doing Zumba together before the run started and so on. I mean, all of the very important things that diplomats and rabbis do. But the most special thing was that there is a tradition that the ambassador to the UK and the chief rabbi sit together once a month to discuss what is going on in the two countries. And I realized very early on that I would be foolish to spend this time just dealing with work. So I suggested to Rabbi Sachs, let me make some notes so that we can get the work out of the way in the first few minutes, and then let's study together. And we tried to do that, and I'll be quite honest, it wasn't a great success because, first of all, Rabbi Sachs wasn't particularly a chavruta type person, and as you can imagine, the gap between us was more than a little bit. So I thought about it, And then I said, okay, we can't do Mir Yeshiva. Let us try Cambridge University. If we can't do a Chavruta, let's do a tutorial. And I said, before we meet, I am going to send you a list of what seems to me the big questions of the time. And I'd like you to just to take any one of them and talk about it. And that was an extraordinary privilege. I had to say, later this week, we have the opening of the Rabbi Sachs archive at the National Library. And the archivist, Rachel Misrati, took me over. She says, I found something that you're going to like to see. And it was one of my notes to Rabbi Sachs and his notes that he had prepared in response, which just blew me away, that he had actually made notes to prepare in response to these questions and so on. So that was quite extraordinary. Anyway, but thank you for asking.
Okay, we're going to pass over to Tanya now. Tanya, please share with us, what did you choose to read and learn with us and why for this particular moment?
Okay, so firstly, it's wonderful to see everyone. I'm on my home ground. That's why there's the woo-woos. It's not everywhere, don't worry. And thank you to you, Karen, for your tireless work for this event and generally for everything you do at Matan. It's really so wonderful to work with you always. So I wanted to share something from a book called The Home We Build Together. Many years ago, I approached Matthew Miller, who is the head of Koren Publishers, and I said to him, I really believe you should be translating The Home We Build Together, even though it's really quite British in its genre and its guise and what it's talking about. It's really talking about British society, how in a world of multiculturalism, you can build a unified narrative, a unified country, a country where there's a common story and a common goal and social capital and all those things we talk about. But when I read it, I thought to myself, this is so very applicable to Israel. And at the time, Matthew said to me, I'm not sure because it's very British and I'm not sure the Israelis are going to get it. And I said to him, well, I'm not sure you're right, but fine. I'm not going to argue with you. And then I saw him a few years later and he said to me, we're translating it. And it just came out now in Ivrit, really a few months ago. And I want to read you a small extract from that and explain why I think it's particularly poignant for the moment we're in at this time. He says like this: social contract is about power and how it is to be handled within a political framework. Social covenant is about how people live together despite their differences. Social contract is about government. Social covenant is about coexistence. Social contract is about laws and their enforcement. Social covenant is about the values we share. Social contract is about the use of potentially coercive force. Social covenant is about moral commitments, the values we share and the ideals that inspire us to work together for the sake of the common good. I think for a minute back to October the 6th and the divisiveness and the polarization and everything that we were reading and hearing and feeling. And I remember at the time, the conversations we were having, and I kept thinking to myself in Saxian language, this is the fracture, this is the fragmentation of the home we build together, of the covenant. What are we going to do when we no longer have a common language, never mind a common narrative, never mind a covenantal society? We don't anymore have the language to speak to each other. And then on October the 7th, our enemies clearly recognized that we were going in that way, and they used it to their advantage. But I kept thinking all the time about the numbers 7 and 8, because on October the 7th, our enemies came, they used our disadvantage, which was the polarization and the divisiveness in society, and they came and they attacked us. But what they didn't reckon was what was going to happen on October the 8th. And that was all of a sudden, we tapped back in to our almost supernatural power. And why do I say that? In Judaism, the number 7 represents nature. Number 8 represents something above nature. If you think about Hoshana Rabbah, and it was, and that was even more crazy that it was Hoshana Rabbah. If you think about Hoshana Rabbah, if you think about Hanukkah, all of these are 8 days. They represent the idea of being above nature. Now, if you look at the social theorists, people like Hobbes and Rousseau and Locke, many of those social theorists talk about, even Marx in his own way, he's not a social theorist, but even his philosophy, they speak about the idea of man's nature. For example, Hobbes, who was a very famous social theorist, he speaks about the idea of the state of nature. And in the state of nature, according to many of these philosophers, the natural state of man is a state of divisiveness, of violence, of everyone out for their own self-interest. They don't believe that naturally we have a kind of a proclivity towards unity or coming together or relational, covenantal relationships. And yet on October the 8th, we proved, the Jewish people, that actually by our very nature, deep down, we are not Hobbes' state of nature, we're the opposite. We are, in fact, a people that transcends that natural inclination towards violence. And instead, our natural inclination as the Jewish people is towards unity. And I think what Rabbi Sachs perhaps would say to us is we need to tap into October the 8th, into Yom HaShmini, the 8th day, that number 8, the transcendence, that idea that no, we're going to resist that natural inclination towards violence and towards, fractious relationships. And instead, we're going to unify, we're going to come together. And that's, in my mind, social covenant. And that's really, I think, what Rabbi Sachs is saying. So this, to me, is such an important paragraph in understanding him. Thank you, Tanya.
This is not fair. You have such eloquent English and accents. And naturally, as I think the only Sabra on the born in Israel, I didn't prepare my homework. So everything now, fits into the boxes. Okay, didn't do my homework, not eloquent in English, but I'll try my best. I did send, now I sound even more stupid. I did send Karen a piece, but I didn't understand we need to read it. Okay, so it's even double cluelessness. Okay. You'll forgive me. I'll talk about, I think, a founding idea in, at least for us in the fourth quarter of what Rabbi Sachs wrote about. And you know what? Maybe a word about the impact of Rabbi Sachs. Right now, when we're sitting here, I think it's still going on. Yes, in Kfar Maccabiyah, there's what we call town halls. We do in Rivon Revi, in the movement, town halls. That's how we recruit people. And there's now, I think, a few hundred, 400, 500 people now in Kfar Maccabiyah. But the basic ideas that they learn there about how to fix Israel are the ideas of Rabbi Sachs. And what's beautiful, nobody approached us about Rabbi Sachs. Nobody from the Rabbi Sachs Foundation never heard about that. We just read the books and we decided this is what we believe in. So I think there's a whole movement of 150,000 people now in Israel that is based on a lot of what Rabbi Sachs wrote about. I think in order to talk about what I think is the founding idea of Rabbi Sachs, 60 seconds to describe the metrics that I think we're in. By the way, I think the metrics is the whole Western world in a metrics, but in Israel, it's specifically heated. The metrics we're in is we are in the era of what we call hyperpolarization. That's a fact. We see it by data. We see it by heart. You don't need to convince people that this is the era we are polarized. By the way, we're much more emotionally polarized than ideologically polarized. Now, in Israel, in the past 2 years, generally, and since the 7th of October, there is a mixture between hyperpolarization and existential fraction. Now, you would say, it's interesting, Tanya, you say that in the 8th of October, our intuition would say once you have existential friction, then polarization will go down, okay? It was in the first 3-4 months, Biyachad Nenatzeach, that was it was all about. But then we found out that our problems, the polarization sits on such a poisoned soil that unless we start actually fixing something fundamental in the way that we function in society and in politics, maybe we'll talk about it later, it will just go back, come back, and come back, and come back. And you can see the past few days, we're becoming, by the way, indexes show that polarization now is higher than the 6th of October, okay? But you can see it, you can feel it, what's happening. So you ask yourself, when we go and I tour Israel, I talk to Israelis, I've done already, we do parlors, that's how we recruit. I've done already 392 parlors in the past 2 years. Okay, and we've done thousands and talk to Israelis, and you ask yourself, how do you get out of this vicious circle where people are frightened because of the existential friction? They are polarized, the polarization is emotional, and we need to build Israel 2.0. And there comes the fundamental idea of Rabbi Sachs that defines or differs between politics of victimhood versus politics of hope. And he says, well, politics of victimhood is interested in the past. Politics of hope is interested in the future. Let's say a word about it because I think it's fundamental. Politics of victimhood basically is the place, by the way, it's very human, but it's the place where we raise our pains, where we raise our anxieties, our fears from one another. We look at our history, and we're actually, in a way, Rabbi Sachs says, you can't change your history. What happened, happened. And it is important to actually talk about our fears and pains and so on. But as in Israel today, I want to tell you something that I think is very dangerous. Everybody feels that they are losing, not to the enemy, within Israel. Everybody, you're in the coalition if you're losing, you're in a position if you're losing. That's a vicious circle where Rabbi Sachs says the only solution there is to actually do what, in my mind, I think also he writes about it, not in these words, is the Jewish startup. We're the people of the past, but our startup is always the future. When you look at Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, when the temple is burning and the Spasianus asks you, what do you want? Doesn't say, I want the temple. He says, I want Yavne. He looks already at the future. After the pogrom in Kishinev, immediately they initiate the Aliyah Shniya in the deportation, in the displaced person camps, in the DP camps. 250,000 Jews out of 18 million in Europe. And they initiate the political organization that actually creates, I don't know, many people don't know that, the partition plan. It means that always we do not get stuck in the past, in victimhood, but rather we look to the future. That's politics of hope. So I think that's the fundamental idea. We're trying to actually bring people that message. If we're gonna be stuck with politics of victimhood, this is a metrics, this is a loop that will just never end, and we're not fulfilling our potential in the best case scenario, and we're being eaten from inside and then from the outside in the worst case scenario. So I think these are two fundamental ideas that I wanted to bring.
Thank you. I actually want to turn to Tanya now. We're going back and forth a bit. I think it's important to give us more of a foundation in Rabbi Sachs's thought as we keep moving forward to talk about Israeli society. And so, Tanya, because you've taught so much about this, I would love for you to talk a little bit about Rabbi Sachs, even though you could give quite a few classes on this. Talk a little bit about Rabbi Sachs, how Rabbi Sachs uses the notion of covenant, how he takes the biblical concept of covenants, of brit, and applies it to modern society. And in particular, let's think about the current climate, which of course Yoav has already alluded to, and I'm going to have more follow-up questions for Yoav soon. But let's get the basis of this idea down before we move on.
So I think there's many things we can talk about. And I think Yoav really concisely kind of portrayed this whole idea of victimhood, which is very important. And you see it in most books of Rabbi Sachs, how the importance of taking agency rather than remaining the victim. But I think one concept that really dominates his thinking is the idea of covenant. And for a minute, I just want to go backwards and focus on your question. So the question is, how can we use Rabbi Sachs's idea of covenant to address the challenge of the moment? So first, I think we have to ask the question, what is the challenge of the moment? So as you said, it began with polarization. Obviously, we have an existential threat, which we're not going to talk to at this moment in terms of Rabbi Sachs. I think there's a lot to say in terms of how Rabbi Sachs understands anti-Semitism. But the aim of this evening is really to talk about, you know, our internal threat in Israel itself. So I think first and foremost, the greatest threat, and I would say, I would frame it in Rabbi Sachs's language, is we've lost the idea of a covenantal home. We've lost the idea of a covenantal language. Language is super important for Rabbi Sachs. If we don't have a shared language, we have no way of even creating the third thing we've lost, which is a covenantal narrative. Now, I was exposed to a lot of Yoav's work, and I went to a massive event at the expo of 5,000 people, unbelievable event of Harivon Haravi. If you haven't heard it, please look it up. It's a really important grassroots organization that Yoav has been heading for the last few years. And they spoke there about creating a new story. And I'm sure Yoav's going to speak about that. But that's what we're also lacking. There's no story. There's no narrative. Everyone's talking about their own narrative, their own story. So that's also a problem. And that is fueled by polarization, by the idea that only my truth, only my interests. And I think it goes back again. So how do we address it in terms of Rabbi Sachs? I think it goes back to, and here I would pull in kind of three fundamental, I would say, like covenantal ideas that Rabbi Sachs brings to the fore in his writings. First and foremost, if we're looking at the Bible, and again, we don't have time to understand how he develops the idea of covenant. But if we begin with the Bible, Rabbi Sachs says that the Bible was radical. It was a radical idea. Why was it so radical? Because in the ancient world, the man was simply a pawn in the workings of the gods, right? You manipulated the gods, or you tried to sway the gods in order to get the gods to do what you wanted. But ultimately, the gods did whatever they wanted. They weren't interested in man. Man was almost passive. And for the first time, at least how Rabbi Sachs understands it, a brand new concept of Brit, of covenant, comes to the fore in the Bible. And that is that God believes in man. God believes that the world can be changed, not just by the gods or God, but rather by man. So the first thing we understand, says Rabbi Sachs, is that instead of there just being this idea of a unilateral covenant between, or a unilateral contract, let's not even use the word covenant, between the gods and human beings, all of a sudden in Parashat Lech Lecha, we're introduced to a new concept, and that's the idea of a bilateral covenant. That's the idea that man and God work together, that God isn't going to come down and just make the world better. But actually, one of the reasons we're here on earth is to take responsibility and to make the world better. So the concept of covenant, Rabbi Sachs founds in the Bible. He talks about the idea that both people have to be subjects, that both people have to see the other as a subject, and that both people have to take responsibility for a greater goal. And one of the places he sees that is the idea of in Sefer Bamidbar and even Sefer Shemot already, where the people come out of Egypt, they're a bunch of slaves. They have nothing holding them together. There's no unity, there's no narrative. They've been in exile for many years. And Rabbi Sachs says, what's the first thing they have to do? They have to build the Mishkan. So it's a building project between man and God, where each person is working towards something bigger. So that's the first notion of covenant. The second idea that I think is really, really important for Rabbi Sachs is the idea of freedom. And he loves quoting Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French diplomat politician who went to America in the 1800s. And he went and he saw what was going on, maybe the early 1900s, saw what was going on in America. And he came back and he said, America's unbelievable because on the one hand, there's individualism. Everyone is radically individual. There's autonomy and agency and people are doing amazing things. But at the same time, there's this incredible sense of community, this incredible sense of social responsibility. And he predicted what would happen today, hundreds of years earlier. He said, if we focus just on liberty, it's going to lead to radical individualism. Today, what we're seeing. And so he said, and this is why he loved bringing him in, because he said, look at what Alexis de Tocqueville said. He says to us that if we want liberty as it is in all its glory to stand, you have no choice but to create bonds between people. So it's not just the individual self-interest, it's looking outside of that. It's looking towards something bigger. So that's the second thing I think for Rabbi Sachs. Covenant is upwards, and it's kind of horizontal and vertical. It's horizontal in terms of our relationship with others. There has to be that subject, I, thou, and Buber's language relationship, but it's also vertical. There has to be an acknowledgement that I am part of something bigger than myself. That's the second thing. And the third thing, and this is in the book Morality, he talks about the idea of the movement from the I to the we, to the we, to the I. And he says, you know, it began with the French Revolution and Enlightenment and emancipation, where we have been oppressed by this kind of very oppressive a society that kind of repressed the individual. And all of a sudden, the individual was given rights again and given autonomy. And then the I was born. But what happened? It became too oppressive of the I. And Rabbi Sachs says it's now time that we move back from the I to the we. And that involves, again, the idea of covenant. So covenant here is really about the idea, not just what I gain, but what I give in society. It's about moral commitment. It's about a collective we. And most importantly, it's about relationship. Rabbi Sachs' relationship it's not transaction. It's not about what I can gain. It's not about contract. It's about relationship. So I think that would be where we as a society in Israel need to start going back to think about something, not just about what we can gain in our groups, but rather, or even in our groups as individuals, but what we can gain as a whole. To ask the question, this is a question I always ask myself, what is our Mishkan? And I don't mean that from a religious perspective. I mean that from what is sacred in our society. What is a sacred thing that we can all encamp around and have an agreement about? And that creates our building, our mutual building project. That, okay, not everyone's going to be 100%, not everyone's going to give exactly the same. And everyone's going to be 100% happy with 100% of things, as in your movement, they always say. But what is there something that all of us consider sacred in Israel today? And from at least in my mind, I would say that's where Rabbi Sachs would begin, at least the way that I see it.
Thanks, Tanya. That's such a positive audience. Now I would like to move from the theory to the establishing of the theory. Actually, we're going to go with Yoav and then Daniel. Both of you are getting a practical question based on this theory. Yoav, I want to go back to what you were talking about, the divisions in Israeli society, which we've already alluded to. We don't need to go over again. How should we be thinking about where these divisions begin and how to begin to resolve these divisions? And so in particular, how can Israel as a country develop a unified, some social covenant, social contract of a unified narrative, given that there's 4 different or more educational systems that teach different curriculum, that teach a different, really a different narrative of what brings them meaning, be it based on religion or secularity or anything else. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So let's start with the division in 2 sentences. First, I'm also an historian. When do you know that we're in a transitional period in history when 3 things are changing? Ideas, technology, and economic models. Sometimes 1 is changing, sometimes 2 is changing. When 3 is changing, usually it's the perfect storm, okay? It happened between 2 world wars. It happened before the French Revolution. First of all, this is the period since 2008, when the new liberal order, because of the big crisis, started going down, immigration, diversity in countries, and so on. We're in a transition stage in the world. Models are appearing and models are going. Extremism usually flourishes. Extreme leaders, not that I'm referring to anyone, but extreme leaders rise. The center usually, or the bourgeois, as the French say, collapse. It just doesn't hold anymore. So first of all, this is a global phenomenon because of diversity, because of economy, and because of technology. Specifically in Israel, there is the 4th quarter phenomenon, because that's the reason we call the movement 4th quarter. Ben Gurion already said in 48, one day, when in the 70s, listen to that, he says it in 48, when you will be 70, 75 years old, a new generation will come about. A generation that did not know the Holocaust survivors, did not know the pioneers, I will add, did not know the Ma'abarot, and so on and so on. And that generation will not be able to dwell only on the past, but actually will have to tell or write the story of the future. And this is naturally what we're experiencing. Now let's go from practicality to your question. So that's the picture. We're in the era of polarization. We're 75 years old. American Civil War was in their first, in the fourth quarter, in the first 100 years. Big crisis in France in the fourth quarter. Italian fascism. USSR collapses in the fourth quarter. So things happen in the fourth quarter. Now, I want to be practical and use Rabbi Sachs' discourse. Tanya talked about covenant. For 20 years, in my social work, I tried to avoid the issue of dealing with covenant. I said, it's impossible. It's impossible. You sit down with the leaders. In Maoz, I worked with elites of the different groups in Israel, and you ask them, what's your vision for Israel in the future? If they answer like this, it's okay, it's very good. That's friction, that's good. But if one answer is here, the other there, the other there, the other there, you say, okay, let's not talk about covenant. Let's talk about what Rabbi Sachs calls treaty, amana, contract. Okay, contract. But at some point I understood that there will be no way avoiding this issue of covenant. And you see it more so in the educational system. So first of all, Israel doesn't have an educational system. It has 4 educational systems, okay? That's a fact. If you want to know the number, 39% study in first grades today in the Mamlachti Chiloni, in the secular, 14 to 15% are in Dati Leumi, 24% are in the Arab system, and 22% are in the Haredi system. The mere definition of what is a state, let alone the state of Israel, is totally different between these populations. So we would say, no worries, let's education, let's do a socialization process in school. So look, we don't have clear data and research, but we assume that the curriculum that are mutual to them, not in English and mathematics, although in Israel with the Haredis it's also relevant, but leave aside even English and mathematics, and what we call מקצועות of השקפה. How do you say השקפה? Like where you formed your values, your worldview, so on. We estimate 5 to 10% overlap between the students in Israel. So guys, this is a time bomb that we put when the children are 6 years old, and naturally there won't be a covenant. By the way, there won't be a contract also. So what we decided in the fourth quarter is to start with a covenant. We created a process of a year with thousands of Israelis. And we said, let's see what is actually the updated Israeli story that is based on the past. And these are the set of values that we can actually 80% agree on. We don't need 100% agreeing on. And I'll conclude that point. We manufactured a document, which I think is good, is not perfect, but we need to keep on working on it. But I think and today, a lot of the criticism that we get from liberals in Israel and so on, they say, what are your boundaries? Okay, who's not invited to the fourth quarter? And there I use also something that Rabbi Sachs didn't say directly, but I think he did mean it. I said, look, we wrote a story together. The story is fueled with the values that we believe in. So these are the boundaries. Stop saying, and that's the Rabbi Sachs notion, I think, and then that's also the woke movement and so on. Stop saying who's out. Offer a story and invite people to engage with the story. Let's transfer to what do we do and not what we don't do. And I think that's also the grand mission that we have in the educational system and reform that we need to have in Israel. Maybe we'll talk about it later.
Well, we have a long way to go. So we will take a small break from the topic of Israeli society and come back to it soon. And now I'd like to turn to Daniel. And you've already mentioned several times the phrase, tell the story. And I want to ask, all of you have mentioned it, in fact, and I want to ask you about telling the story and Rabbi Sachs' thoughts on telling the story. If you think about what we're living through today, besides people having different versions of the story in Israel, the Jewish people has a version of our story today, be it the war that's being fought on numerous fronts or the story of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the world. And that story is very different from when it's told from some of our, let's just say, not such great friends, our enemies. And I'd like to ask you how you bridge these worlds of Israel and diaspora. And in particular, when you look at what's going on in America, in Europe, we just saw what happened in Amsterdam, about how language is used against us and how the story is being told very differently. Is it possible to repair this? And how should we be playing a part, the we here, be playing a part in telling our story today?
So finally, an easy question.
No more house painting.
So I tell you, I want to start before I talk about Rabbi Sachs. I just want to make a couple of short observations about the challenges of Hasbara, which is what you're really talking about, telling Israel's story, that I don't think are always fully credited. So I think if we're talking about stories, one of the challenges that Israel has is that it actually needs to tell two very different stories simultaneously. It needs to tell a story to the West, but it also needs to tell a story to our region. And the story that the West wants to hear is that we are victims that should be pitied. And the story that the region needs to hear is that we are mighty and we should be feared. And it's very difficult to tell those two stories simultaneously, especially in a time when social media will translate and so on and so forth. I think the other thing is, if we're honest, we are today the victims of seeds that have been planted by our enemies over many generations. And there's a lesson for us here. If you want just a small example, I don't know how many of you have been following the BBC coverage, which is appalling beyond belief. But last week, 250 employees of the BBC wrote a letter to the management complaining that their coverage was too pro-Israel. If you just want to get a sense of seeds that have been planted so nefariously. Rabbi Sachs cared deeply about the challenge of Israel's Hasbara. I would say the only time that he sounded like a regular Anglo-Jew was when he was complaining to me about Israel's Hasbara. But he didn't just complain. He did two things that I think were very important. The first is that he helped me on the quiet. He said once, I want to make a dinner party for you. Who would you like me to invite? And I said, you're very well connected in the world of the media, with the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, talk of the day on the BBC. Let's invite the leading journalists. And we had a quiet dinner at his house, which will remain off the record. But that was one of the ways in which he helped, away from that limelight. But he also made a number of speeches, particularly in the House of Lords, where he was one of the most effective spokespeople for Israel. And if I had to distill from that, maybe just 3 lessons for us that I think are important. So the first, I'll just roll back. Although I got to know Rabbi Sachs very well when I was in London, that's not the first time that I saw him. Well, the first time that I actually saw him, I was probably 12 years old. And he came to try out for the job of rabbi in my parents' shul. And the thing that I remember, I don't remember what he spoke about, but what I do remember is that he didn't get the job. And he didn't get the job because he sounded like a Cambridge academic, which is what he was at the time. And I mention this not to denigrate him, but in his praise, because he knew that every form of conversation was something that needed to be studied and learned and constantly improved. And every type of communication that he engaged in, whether it was a TED talk, or whether it was talk of the day, or whether it was an editorial in one of the newspapers, he crafted it and crafted it and improved it and improved it. And I think that sense of constantly striving to improve our message, to improve our communication, is something that we need to take away from it. And I'll be honest, I'm just thinking about Rabbi Sachs as a model of a leader. It would be much, much easier for all of us if we could say that he was just like somebody with God-given talents that fell from heaven. But the real challenge that he presents to us is he's somebody who worked on himself until he reached those levels, and that really raises a question for all of us. The second thing, and I think this relates to what Tanya was saying, he never argued from a position of victimhood. He always tried to argue from a position of pride and from a positive vision. And as difficult as it is today, and one of the reasons we have such a hard time on US campuses and so on, is because there really is a hierarchy of victimhood, this intersectionality that tracks everybody and so on. And we don't want to play that game. Zionism is a rebellion against the notion of victimhood. And in a way, it is our secret weapon, having a positive vision. When I used to go and speak on university campuses, there was almost always a demonstration outside the lecture hall. And it was a very interesting demonstration, because if you looked at who made it up, it was a strange alliance of radical leftists and radical Islamists, what people sometimes call the Red-Green Alliance. And if you want to break up that coalition, it's very easy. You just have to say, I know what you're against, but what do you stand for? Are you in favor of women's rights? Are you in favor of freedom of expression? And that coalition just disintegrates before your eyes, which is why the whole notion of having a positive vision is so critical. And the third thing, and here I'm echoing what both Tanya and Yoav have both said, almost whenever he spoke in defense of Israel, he told a story. And the power of a story, many of his books actually are stories, not in God's name about Islamic or religious fundamentalism. It's really a story of brotherhood in the Bible. Letter in the Scroll is Judaism as the story of the development of ideas. And when he spoke about these issues, and one of the things that's so powerful about a story, first of all, as Yoav says, it has so many entry points that people can come in and join you, but it stays with people and it helps them think in the future. One of the stories that he told that I think was so important was the story of anti-Semitism. He didn't speak about anti-Semitism very often because he wanted a Jewish identity that was positive, that was forward-thinking. But when he did speak about anti-Semitism, he said, the story of anti-Semitism is this. Anti-Semitism is a virus that mutates to project on the Jews the opposite of whatever is the most dominant value, the most highly held value of the time. So when the most highly held value was religious, then Jews were the Christ killers. When the most highly held value was the purity of the race, that's when Jews were the Untermenschen, polluting the race. And today, when the highest held value of the religion of the West is human rights, that's when Jews are portrayed as the worst abusers of human rights. It's a simple story, but it's incredibly powerful. And I think it helps people, rather than giving a fact or giving a denial of a specific report, it gives people a frame of mind that helps them absorb and process what they're hearing. And I think that's one of the secrets of effective Hasbara.
Wow. Amazing. I think many of the people here are Olim and can certainly identify feel this is an issue that is very close to our hearts, and that is incredibly thought-provoking and practical. Thank you. So Yoav, I want to turn back to you, and we just have a few more questions left, and then we'll let people go home for the night. We've spoken quite a bit about our story, about our social contract, and related to both those things, we've also talked about how to disagree constructively. And I think we need to address tonight what is probably the most burning issue in Israeli society right now, And of course, we'll try to frame this in a Rabbi Sachs way, in a positive and constructive way. We are hearing voices of people reaching the breaking point here in Israel, in particular from the Dati Leumi community. We've heard Rav Tamir Granot make a video who teaches here, pleading with the Haredim to not take the exemption from the draft. We've seen Rachel Goldberg at the Shiva for her husband pleading for the Haredim to draft. And I would just love to hear from you what you've learned from your experience with the fourth quarter, with bridging different kinds of people, working with very different sectors of the Israeli population, Maoz. What would be the best practices for getting people who disagree quite significantly to speak to each other and try to come up with constructive solutions?
Okay, so it's a lot about perceptions. You know what? I'll say 60 seconds about my Rabbi Sachs story. Just kind of a funny story, but it will, from there, it will be a vehicle to continue. I met Rabbi Sachs once in my life. We were in Harvard Business School with the Maoz fellows, Israeli leaders, diverse. And before they were, I don't know, 40, 50, before he came, I told them, look, he's a Lord, he's a rabbi, he's my hero. Do not ask questions. Do not embarrass me, okay? I warn you, because all week they embarrassed us in Harvard. Okay, he comes and he gives a speech, and he's so engaging and inspiring. And then one Bedouin guy raises his hand at the end. I already said, okay, and he says, excuse me, why did you send us all these Jews? Why didn't you come to Israel and Jews like you? So that's my Rabbi Sachs story. Now, what does it have to do with Haredi? This? Look, we're in a problem, in a deep problem. I'll explain why. Because I'll tell you in a moment practically what we did in the movement. We have thousands of Haredis in the movement. But you know what? I want to say something that is not popular. Put aside the war for 30 seconds, and I'll come back to the war. If we're in covenant mode, people who were exempted, not only from the army, but also from even any expectation to be a part of the covenant that is called the Israeli society, are poof, one day asked by all of us with rage, you now join the covenant. You guys, I just came, I don't know, you made up my army position. I have nothing to do with strategy, okay? But I was in infantry and I came back now to the army. I was called to volunteer after 11 years. I didn't do miluim. Okay.
Got it from your website.
What? From a website? Okay, so that's
website,
okay. So maybe I made it up. Sounds more strategy, more than that. But in order to fight in Gaza and basically go to die for your country, it's not something you do instantly. It's not something that you need to be in some kind of a framework of a covenant. You need to be educated to that. You need to actually have a perception on what are you fighting for. It's not that instrumental. So first of all, that's why we have a real problem, because on the one hand, I understand, and I belong to the people who are demanding change in this arena. But on the other hand, I don't care about the Haredi leadership. That's a lost case. They're defending, that's sociology. They're defending their system. They will never let it go. But I ask myself, how do we approach what I call the independent Haredis? Haredis who want to actually continue being Haredi on the one hand, and on the other hand, want to be Israeli. And we're telling them now that this is not going to be a process. You're going tomorrow morning, you'll go to the army. Big problem, okay? Big problem. So first of all, let's acknowledge that, because, and I know it's not popular to say this, that in these days. We sat down a few months ago with activists who are Haredim and activists from the army, just citizens. And we created a framework of actually creating a solution, a roadmap. Before it was that heated, we didn't understand the shortage that will be. A roadmap. And the roadmap, basically, everybody concentrated on what we offered practically. We said 30% will be immediately drafted because they're not in the yeshivas. 40%, there will be a transition period of 3 to 5 years, which actually will be drafted with their yeshivas to assignments, and there will be a whole preparation. 30% after, only we see that these 70% were absorbed, then the last 30% will be recognized as Toratam Emanutam, and actually the narrative of the Haredis will be embedded in the covenant, and these 30% actually will be equal to soldiers in the rights, in their that. And we also said that from the age 28, you will go through training, 15,000 a year will go through training of 2 to 5 months, and then they will serve in positions that will be helpful to exempt Miluimnikim. Okay, that was our offer. But more important is that the basis of the offer began with the fact that we're building a covenant. And in that covenant, we need to understand that a problem, as I said, that was created for 45 years is not going to be solved in one day. And on the other hand, for the Haredis, to understand that from the 7th of October, we understood something. We will not be able, and I think this is literally, we will not be able to survive, but more important, to flourish, to, let's be Rabbi Sachs, to actually fulfill the potential. And I think, maybe there'll be a closing question, I think we can inspire people, inspire the world. That's our mission, to inspire the world. We will not be able to do it without the Haredis. That was the premises for the conversation. Now, people ask us right now, so why aren't you? So we did a small campaign, but nobody was interested back then. Was not a big idea, a big issue. Now people ask us right now, so why aren't you bringing this solution? And we say because, and this comes to the covenant and contract, because the conversation with the current government is not now being held in the level of covenant. It's being held in the level of contract. And in the level of contract, they're trying to steal horses. And when you steal horses, the only statement that I have for you is that you do not legislate this law. I don't care what you do, you just do not legislate. You recognize that you do not legislate and you do not steal horses. Now let's start talking about solution. But what's important is before, and that's my last comment, and this is the beginning of a covenant. That's why we're working very hard to actually create a movement that will change, will go up from society to politics. Before that, what we did is we gathered our Haredi leadership. We have 3,000 to 4,000 Haredis in the movement. We have 25 leaders that are in the Haredi leadership. We gathered them and we asked them, what is the minimum that we can say, which is the maximum that you can live with, that you won't leave? On the other hand, we'll create that disruption and say to that government, this contract won't work. And actually, you suddenly see that when they're asked, they gave us a leash that is way beyond what even I expected. So I think maybe that's an example of how to use Rabbi Sachs' language, but in actually practical terms, not in theoretical terms. Oh, and by the way, there's no immediate solution to that problem. So don't hold your.
Okay, so I have one final question, a question of hope, which I'm going to ask the three of you. Before I do, I just want to give just a short, brief moment to Tanya, who also, like Daniel, even though Yoav, you did meet Rabbi Sachs once, you also had a personal relationship with Rabbi Sachs. And because we're sitting here and commemorating his yahrzeit, I would love for you to share how you feel that he embodied his philosophy, his approach, some of the things we've spoken about, language, healing society, and arguing constructively. Any of those points you'd like to talk about in his day-to-day life, how you saw that.
So I want to begin. I'll do a little promotion here. Please God, a podcast that's coming out very soon that I've been working tirelessly on over the last year, and Yoav's been my guest on it. Please God, it's going to come out in December. It's really in order to promote his books. Many people know Rabbi Sachs through his Parshanut, through his Torah commentary, but the truth is that I believe his real chidushim, I mean, his beautiful chidushim are obviously also in his Torah commentary, but the foundation of those chidushim, I really believe, come in his books. And I think if you really want to access the wisdom, the perennial wisdom of Rabbi Sachs, you have to tap into the books. And here at Matan, we've done a kind of, I would say, like a showcase of that over the last 2 years, where we've had the most amazing group of women and men reading Rabbi Sachs's book, and we've come together every week. And I thought, how can I bring that to the wider world? And that's what the podcast is going to be. And it's going to be a narration. And again, to go back to the idea of a story, it's really going to tell a story. Each book is a discussion, but it's also a narration of many different voices and the intersection of Rabbi Sacks with the big questions today. And as part of that, I've interviewed many, many different people. And one of them is Gila, Rabbi Sacks's daughter. And she said something fascinating to me when I was speaking to her, which really kind of reminded me of the danger of hagiography, which is basically to make someone into a saint, especially after their death. And she said, Gila said, I don't think my father would want that. My father, and I think, Daniel, you said it so beautifully, like Rabbi Sacks, and he was very insistent also on talking about their avot and their mahot. These were normal human beings. They were very great, super great, but their greatness was born in the fact that they were able to transform themselves. And I think Rabbi Sacks was that kind of person. And the reason he was able to do that, I believe, is because he mentions a few personal stories that he comes back to again and again. And I just want to mention two of them. And then I want to share with you very briefly what happened, my experience. One of them was when he was very young, and he turned around to his father at one point. I think he mentions this, I think, in Radical Then, Radical Now. He turns around to his father and he says to his father, he asks his father a question. And his father says, listen, I didn't have a good Jewish education, Jonathan, but one day you will, and you'll be able to answer that question and tell me all about it. And I think that sense, we go back to the idea of why does the notion of victimhood and agency run through all of Rabbi Sacks's thinking? Because I believe that Rabbi Sacks really believed that the way in order for people to take responsibility, you have to give them a sense of agency. And from a very young age, in many ways, Rabbi Sacks's father said to him, I'm handing you the responsibility to teach me. And that's what Rabbi Sacks did. And the other story, which we know is the most famous story of Rabbi Sacks, which is when he goes to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe after his epiphany in 1967, the Six-Day War, where all of a sudden he says, I realized there were some things that I don't choose, right? This kind of 1960s Enlightenment philosophy of you choose everything. And Rabbi Sacks says all of a sudden in 1967, with the Six-Day War, he recognized that Judaism, his Jewish identity chose him rather than him choosing it. And he goes on kind of a journey to America, and he meets Rav Soloveitchik and Rabbi and Rabbi Menachem Schneerson and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says, Lubavitcher Rebbe, he asks him a whole load of questions. Rabbi Sacks asks him, and then the Lubavitcher Rebbe turns around to him and says to him, and tell me, Jonathan, what are you doing in Cambridge at the moment? He says, well, I'm studying philosophy and I'm doing this. No, but what are you doing for Jewish life in philosophy at the moment, in Cambridge at the moment? Well, the situation in which I find myself, a very British answer. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe looked at him and said, you don't find yourself in a situation, you put yourself into a situation. And to my mind, that was the second moment in which Rabbi Sacks realizes that he, and we know very well, that he understood that he had been given a sense of belief by someone in him and in his power and his responsibility to be a leader for the Jewish people. And this notion, as I think Karen mentioned at the beginning with Oshra's, I can attest that Oshra does the same thing, that to be a leader means not to create followers, but to create leaders. And I can tell you one story of when I went to go and see Rabbi Sacks, and I came to him with a whole host of questions. I was very young. I think I was just finished my master's, and I was having some religious questions and a crisis of what I wanted to do and various things. And I was speaking to him about it. And I asked him a whole load of questions, and he didn't give me any answers. And I remember as a 25-year-old, I left the room and I was actually deeply frustrated. And I thought to myself, hold on a minute. I just went in with a whole host of questions, and he ended up asking me questions like, what is that? And then quite a few years later, I again had a phone conversation. I was living in Israel, and I asked him about writing my doctorate at the time. And I wanted him to give me an answer. Yes, you should definitely do it, or no, you shouldn't, or life is too busy, or whatever, wait a bit. And he didn't. He simply said to me, Tanya, you will grow whenever you decide to do it. But that decision is yours. And I remember at the time getting off the phone and thinking to myself, he didn't give me an answer. But with hindsight, I recognized that he was doing what other people had done for him. He was telling me, I believe in you to find the answers within yourself. And to me, this is what I call, at least I term it, Rabbi Sacks's dialogical faith, which is the idea, and it goes back to the idea of covenant, the idea that it's not just about the belief we have in God, but it's also about the belief that God has in us. And Rabbi Sachs said this again and again, that God doesn't, it's not just religion, generally, it's not just about the idea that I believe in God, or I believe 10 things before I go to sleep, or I make these propositional faith statements. No, religion is about the idea that actually we believe that God believes in us to take responsibility and take agency. And one more second, I want to go back to the idea of a story, because I think a story here is so important for Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi, why is a story? Why did it, as you both said, stories like at the basis of Rabbi Sachs when he talks about anti-Semitism, everything he talks about it as stories, because a story creates identity. A story is how I build identity. And he notes the Pesach story and the Haggadah, and everything we do once a year that builds our national identity. And he talks about the idea of the Bikurim, when we go up, the farmer goes up with his fruits and says, Armi Oved Avi, and tells the whole story of his people's nation. Why? Because the story is the way I create identity. And to go back to what Yoav said, and it's super painful. I think it's such a painful moment for all of us at the moment, because all of us believe in the story of the Jewish people. All of us believe that there needs to be a story where everyone's counted, whether we agree with the Haredim or we don't, whether we agree with the Sunday. We know that for us to flourish as a people, everyone has to be part of the story. And then the question is, how do we build that narrative? And I think it's a really, really difficult one to answer. But one thing I would say is that if we're going to create the story, I think back to the Declaration of Independence, and there was a massive argument at the time about the word So Yisrael. And the rabbis wanted it to have God's name in it. And the secularists said, no, we don't want God's name in it. And in the end, they came to a compromise that they would put the word So Yisrael. And the rabbi said that means it came from Tehillim, where God is described as the rock of Israel. So they said, okay, we put a tick, God's in the Declaration of Independence. And the secularists said, no, So Yisrael is the cultural inheritance of the people of Israel. They put a tick. What were they both doing? In each of them, they were telling their own story. But the story was a communal story. It was a story where it had a certain interpretation for this one and a certain interpretation for that one. I think the painful thing for us at the moment is we can't even get to that place. I don't have the answer, but I think Rabbi Sachs would draw us back and say to us, we need to begin to think of a way to tell a story where maybe for one part it will sound different, and for another part they'll interpret it differently, but we'll be able to have that shared language. And the one thing, and here maybe can I finish my part and say the hope part? Okay, all right. So then I'll come back.
Okay, so one final question. And okay. Rabbi Sachs has a beautiful piece. We've talked a lot about telling the story. He has a beautiful piece on Parshat Bo, where he talks about America, the United States of America. We've talked a lot about Britain and Israel. We'll talk about America a little bit. And he says America is a covenantal society. And he talks about the monuments in DC. And he writes, covenantal societies always represent a conscious new beginning by a group of people dedicated to an ideal. And if you think about it, of course, the beginning of our state, as we've talked about here, was a renewal of the covenants. I think we're at a point where we have potential for renewal of, we keep using this covenant, but some kind of renewal. We're seeing what we talk about as heat over root. We're seeing it here in Israel. We're seeing it amongst our soldiers, a sudden more of a connection, more of a closeness. We can look around and see all the negative and all the divisions and everything else and all the anti-Semitism, but we can also look around and say, hey, let's look at all of the renewal that's happening, of the reconnecting in Chutz La'aretz as well. We're seeing incredible phenomena we have on the one hand, Jews who are distancing themselves from Israel. We also have people who are Americans who are distancing themselves from American values altogether. And we also have Jews who, to quote Elon Levy, are Gen Zionists, are suddenly becoming much more vibrantly connected to Israel, where they had really no interest or connection before. And so I'd like to end with this question for all of you. And we say in Hatikva, Lo avda tikvatenu. And Rabbi Sachs did write, even though he lived in the diaspora, he wrote very often about Israel and had a tremendous love for Israel and talked about it as the home of hope. So I want to ask you, with all of this going on in our world, feel free to talk about Chutz La'aretz, Israel, both all together. Based on this Rabbi Sachs hopeful message, in the spirit of this hopeful message, what are your sources of hope and inspiration for the future of Israel, for the future of Am Yisrael in the world? Start with Yoav. How's Yoav?
So first, a short story. You spoke about Tzur Israel. So let me give you a short story. Maybe it will be a metaphor on current days about Tzur Israel. So when we wrote the Israeli story, very quickly, the Haredim, the Tzionut Datit, and the secular compromised because they said, where's God? Okay, let's put Tzur Israel, like in Megillat Atzmaut, that was in the beginning, and so on. And then came a group with it's actually a bit transparent in Israel, which is the Mesortim, but not Mesortim in Chutz La'aretz way. Mizrahim, Mesortim, maybe many traditional, maybe many Likud voters and so on. And they said, no, we don't want Tzur Israel. We don't understand what is Tzur Israel. We want Ribon HaOlamim. Surprisingly, Haredi said no. The secular said, you lost your mind. What do you mean Ribon HaOlamim? Because it's the beginning. Be'ezrato shel Ribon HaOlamim. But then, so it was like very, very, very heated. And I said, guys, I went to the secular and I said, it's important to them. Does it offend you? Do you feel something in this story that actually, I told them, remember, a covenant is about, Rabbi Sachs said that, a covenant is about creating trust. A contract is actually managing the distrust, which always happens. And I said, so in trust mode, not in hadata mode, not in this, what do you want? It's important to them. And same to the Haredis, culturally, they might not halachically, and we ended with Ribon HaOlamim. And you can see it in our story. It's still liberals who were not a part of the movement read that and are appalled. But what I wanted to exemplify is actually, if we want to talk about a story, it needs to be innovative. It needs to be disruptive. It needs to create space for more people. What gives me hope? Look, I think at the end of the day, I'm a student of Echad Ha'am. He's a forgotten figure, okay? But I'm secular, and he is the father of secular Judaism. And he talked a lot about the tradition as a mean to actually create a future. And he always said, we the Jewish people, doesn't mean we're better than others, because let me tell you a secret about seculars. They don't like the term Am Sgula. Don't use it with them, okay? They hate it. So we use, by the way, in our story, Or La'amim. Okay, lo lagoim, or la'amim. Or la'amim, that makes sense. But Echad Ha'am said, you see our history, we have something to tell the world. Doesn't mean others don't have, okay? It's okay, but we have something to tell the world. And I think we have something to tell the world. There, in my mind, I a little bit debate with Rabbi Sachs also. And I'll say the following. What do we have, I think, actually to bring to the world because of the war, because we sit between East and West, because we have combination of all phenomena between progressive and liberal and conservative, and this is a crazy place. Yeah, let's be frank. So think of this. In 1945, after 2 world wars, the world came into the era of what we call politics of responsibility. Leaders that grew up in the era of 2 world wars, of the big ideologies, that politics tilted from one to other, and dictatorships came one after the other. Then in 1945, this new generations talked about politics of responsibility, of let's actually create institutions. Let's create a tradition of institutions. Let's create continuity. Let's create, back then it was the welfare state or the New Deal that began before World War, and so on. As I said, we're in a transition moment right now. The world is looking for solutions, and the world is becoming more and more and more crazy. And politics is becoming more and more crazy. I think the idea of politics of covenants, that's where maybe I would argue with him. I think Rabbi Sachs wouldn't love that term. Because, you know, in one of the criticisms that we get from the Chardali crowd is they say, yeah, covenants, achdut, whatever, all words you want to use, that's on societal level. In politics, it's about defeat. No, you have 64, you do what you want. And I think that was a model that was right maybe for 15, 20 years ago, before the social networks, before the diversity, but in the next 25 years, if we actually want to be the first generation in the history of the Jewish people that celebrates 100 years, we've never done that. We've never achieved 100 years. And if we want to actually say something to the world of how do you create a traditional, liberal, thriving state that is peace-seeking, but is not a friar, but is actually has its tzidkat derech, we will need politics of covenant. We will need to change the whole way that the political system actually functions. And I'll tell you, to finish with this, this is a notion we took from Rabbi Isaac, the notion of responsibility. The slogan that you come to the fourth quarter is, we tell people, because I can talk for hours and not mention two things, the press and Bibi, okay? And always people are very mad when right-wing people would say, why aren't you talking about the press? And the more left will say, why aren't you talking about Bibi? And I said, I'll tell you why. Because they're all a reflection of us, okay? Politics, not only Bibi politics, and the press is a reflection of us. So we're all the problem. We are the problem. But good news, we're also the solution. And you see in the past few years, and especially from the 7th of October, wow, that the solution could be inspiring. We just need, and I can tell you from someone who tours the country, gets the criticism and see the pain of Israelis, that this is not going to be easy. We need Herculeses in order to actually overcome the forces of destruction. But I think it's it's a maktub, we say, a maktub that this is, I think, the destiny of this generation. We're going to be the generation who's going to bring to the world the politics of covenant, and we're going to actually prevail and celebrate 100 years much, 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 much stronger than today. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. And Daniel.
So, halavai, amen, please God. So I think what Yoav said is really important, and that's the idea of, first and foremost, and this is an unprecedented crisis in our modern Jewish state, but in some ways it's also an unprecedented opportunity. And I think the questions we have to ask, and this is what Harivon Haravi and many other organizations are trying to do, is to tap into this opportunity and ask, what can we do? So I think first and foremost, what Yoav said is really important. And that is, in some sense, it goes back to Rabbi Sachs and exactly what I said beforehand. We've kind of delegated responsibility to the state and the market and to politicians and to the news anchors and to the press and to anybody else where we want to delegate responsibility. Rabbi Sachs speaks about in one of his books, the privatization of morality, which led to the delegation, to the nationalization of responsibility. Okay, the privatization of morality, meaning I'll just do what I need to do, and it doesn't, as long as I don't affect or harm anyone else, that's fine. And that meant that I'm giving all the responsibility for anything else in society to the state, to the market, to the politicians, to where, and actually I think it's time for us to say no, ad kan, okay? The politicians can do what they're good at, which is the mechanisms of running the state, but we have to take back the responsibility of running the country. And we saw that happen, and I believe it can happen again. And this goes back to the idea that Rabbi Sachs speaks about, which is the state is about contract, but the society is about covenant. And then I asked the question, how can we create this story? Is it even a possibility? Like, Yoav, you've been working for a few years on it. I know you've reached certain points, but can we do it? And the one thing that gives me hope, you asked what gives me hope. So I'll tell you what I found in Israel, which I don't think people living outside Israel necessarily understand unless they come here and they experience it. I don't know if any of you have been to an Israeli concert. By people, and I'll just name a few, but there's plenty, okay? Idan Amedi, Yishai Ribo, Hanan Ben Ari, Hatikva Shesh, okay? I could go on and on and on. Any of them. Choose one, it doesn't matter who it is. Shuli Rand, Akiva, I mean, I've got a few names, right? And one of the things you'll see in these concerts, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, some of them are more religious, some are less religious, but you will see a whole variety, a whole spectrum of Israeli society sitting there, from the left to the right, from the religious to the non-religious, and they're all singing. And they're singing songs, many of the songs with religious significance. And others, less religious significance, more secular, but everyone's singing and everyone's come together. And there's something about this that before the war I found incredible, but now, even with the war, I kind of think to myself, if that's possible, then anything's possible. And Rabbi Sachs was a deep believer in song. He loved Yeshai Ribo. He did a few events with him, but he loved song because song transcends words. Words polarize. Words can be used as a weapon, but song transcends the polarization of words. Song allows me to create a story and a moment, and it gives me something that's beyond the sphere of human comprehension. And I think that if we look at some of the songs that have come out, you know, the war in some senses has made us all mute on so many levels, the pain, the trauma, what we're still going through, we become mute. We don't even have the language to express what so much trauma and so much pain that we're witnessing. And yet somehow the Israeli artists, I believe, they're writing the story of this war. They're writing the story through the songs that they're bringing out. Okay, Hanan Ben Ari's song Moledet and Yishai Ribo's song Sder Prachim. So many different songs that are expressing this Giborei Al Batik Vashesh, beautiful, exactly. So many songs that are expressing what we're all going through, and people are singing them from every part of the Israeli spectrum. And I think that if we're going to talk about covenantal society, and we're going to talk about taking back responsibility and agency and faith in ourselves and faith in our ability to bring hope to the world, because Rabbi Sachs, as we know, says optimism is the idea that everything's going to be okay, but hope is the idea that we're going to make it okay together. If we're going to bring hope to the world, I think the place we can start is actually going to these Israeli artists and saying to them, hold on a minute, you've brought a story here. Let's take some of the elements of this story and let's see how we can work with this to actually involve and bring everyone here together. Bring everyone to a concert. Let everyone sing together. I know it sounds like, you know, la la, John Lennon. No, I really don't mean it in that way. But I do think there's something profound that's happening there. I really believe that there, and it's not, you don't see it anywhere outside. I think it's really, it's very Israeli and it's very new and it's very modern and it's using Tanakh terminology very often, but there's something happening there, and that's my hope. That's where I kind of pin my hope. So now, Yoav, I'm throwing the baton to you. You can take that and do something great with it.
And to Daniel.
So I had a little correspondence with Karen before this evening. And at some point in the correspondence, she said, I hope there'll be some disagreement on this panel. Because, you know, it's all great people who probably agree. And I've been trying to listen very hard to some amazing things to see if there's something that I do disagree with. And I know this is the end and we're supposed to be wrapping up in a fluffy sort of way, but I feel I wouldn't be doing my job. And I don't think we're taking Rabbi Sachs seriously if we don't test him against the reality. And I want to say something in me recoils a little bit at this assumption that everybody has to be part of the song. Everybody has to be part of the story. I think at the end of the day, there are some people, and forgive me for saying it bluntly, who will get left behind. I think in the Torah, we have the notion that there are 70 faces of the Torah, but that doesn't mean there isn't a 71st face that falls without the realm of legitimacy. And actually, if you look in the Talmud, you'll find stories about people who got thrown out of the Bet Midrash. And there's something really interesting, and I think a real lesson for us on why people were thrown out of the Bet Midrash. It is almost never because of the position that they held. It is because they didn't accept the process. They weren't part of the dialogue. And I have to say, I think that's a good litmus test for deciding who is part of the camp and who isn't part of the camp. If somebody says, not only do I not like this story, but there's no story of yours that I will ever join. And I have to say, with a lot of pain, I think that parts of the Haredi community fall into that camp. And I think if we say we are going to try and stretch our covenant so broadly, we're giving a veto to the most extreme element. So I think we need to create a center of gravity. If we look at Jewish history, and we're honest with ourselves, there are those who have been left behind. So forgive me for saying that, but I just want to reality test, because if we take Rabbi Sachs seriously, we need to measure him up against the tough realities. That doesn't mean there isn't room for hope. I think, by the way, of the people on the panel, the one that Rabbi Sachs would enjoy listening to the most, it is Yoav, because this voice of, I mean, he did not believe that there was such a thing as a secular Israeli. And it was such a beautiful thing. There was a conversation he had with Yair Lapid, where Yair Lapid said to him, I don't have a rabbi. If I had a rabbi, it would be you, but I'm not a believer. And Rabbi Sachs responded, he said, the only people who believe that secular Israelis are not believers is secular Israelis. Otherwise, this country simply could not have been built. So I think he would have really enjoyed that. Just to say a word about hope, and as Tanya said, hope is not a passive envisioning of a better future in Rabbi Sachs's thinking. It's something that's active. I think we at this moment have been given a totally extraordinary, historic opportunity. You know, we've seen horrors that have come from another generation, but we are seeing an opportunity that is coming from another generation. We are seeing in America and in other parts of the world what people are calling a surge. Chabad and Hillel have never had so many people showing up. We are seeing this awakening, the amount of donation and volunteering. But I'll be honest, that in itself is not going to be sustainable. You are not going to have a negative agenda that is going to hold the people together for long. And it strikes me that the question that Rabbi Sachs would be asking of us today is, can we move from battling together to building together? We are going to come out of this with the most major reconstruction projects that this country has had almost in its history, in the north and in its south. We're going to have to deal with trauma. We look at the battles against vicious anti-Semitism around the world. Can we make that a joint positive enterprise, an enterprise of pride? And we have, in this period, seen a younger generation that is totally extraordinary. Somehow or other, we are touching a generation of Maccabees. And they have and we need to nurture them and give them the tools and allow them the space. And that, at the end of the day, is what will take us forward. And, you know, probably the comment of Rabbi Sachs to end on the most reflects this was about the Mishkan, that Tanya said, what is the Mishkan that we're around? And there's this very strange sentence in Sefer Shemot, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. They're going to build me this sanctuary, and I am going to dwell, not in the sanctuary, but I'm going to dwell in them, says Rabbi Sachs. God doesn't live in buildings. He lives in builders. And when we build together, that's the way that we'll bring God into the world.
I want to thank you all. I feel this was really a tremendous way to honor the memory of Rabbi Sachs. And thank you all for coming and for caring deeply. And thank you to our guests. Should be Besarot Tovot.
יש לנו 10 למניין, יש פה מישהי שיש לה חיוב קדיש, אפשר, אני רוצה 10 למניין, מה לעשות, אני צריכה את הגברים, מה אני עושה? 10 למניין, יש פה להצביע, גברים רק להצביע בבקשה, 10 למניין, יש לנו פה, בסדר? ג'פרי? יאללה. אנחנו צריכים מניין. יש מניין? ישראל, אתה נשאר להתפלל? דיוויד, אני צריכה מניין. אתה צריך ללכת? נשאר להתפלל? נשאר להתפלל? יש לנו מניין. יאללה, מי ניגש? מי ניגש להתפלל? במניין, כן? מה? כן, לפה, זה לכיוון הזה, סליחה. תביא סידורים, תחלק סידורים שם. יאללה. אתה במניין, נכון?
I hope this was recorded.
Yes, it was.
By
How
far
are
the
you?
best here. I'm recognizing a million percent.
Yes.
Is it going to be put on?
I will
The
send
best
it to
evening
you.
you've ever had. Oh, good. I'm glad.
But tell Karen. אוקיי, אנחנו מתחילים מניין, כן? יאללה, תביאו סידורים. המניין פה, פה, בסדר? ג'פרי, אתה עושה את המניין, אתה מתפלל?
young guys.
אוקיי, יאללה. מי מתפלל? Do you want to be the husband? No. אוקיי, יואל, אתה החתן. אתה אייל? יאללה, אייל, יאללה. יאללה, יאללה. התפללתי, יש לנו פה 10, נשארו כמה? מניין, יאללה, בואו תעמוד פה. 10. יאללה, יש לנו פה? 8. מניין. אוקיי, יופי. אוקיי, בואו לעמוד פה, יש פה 10, תספור. אוקיי, ליאורה? איפה ליאורה? בואי. תן לי ליאורה. מניין. יאללה. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. כן. פה המניין.
So I asked, we're recorded. Thank goodness. Nothing's great. I know you're busy. I'm gonna try. I'm not gonna. I already tried my super.
Amen.